When I walked into his studio and saw myself on the canvas, I stopped breathing. Not because I was shocked by the painting, but because I realized he had seen me, truly seen me, in a way no one had for years. My posture, the soft drape of my robe, even the way my fingers curled when I was nervous, it was all there, immortalized in strokes of color. My husband had never looked at me like that. Not even when we were young. I felt the air thicken as I stepped closer. The painting wasn't erotic. It wasn't even provocative. But it was intimate. Devastatingly so. That was the moment I knew I had crossed a line, long before any lips had touched, long before any vows had broken. I reached out to touch the frame, my fingertips hovering just above the edge, when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. He stood there, watching me, not saying a word. His eyes weren't those of a stepson anymore. They belonged to someone who had claimed something, someone who had painted his truth. And in that moment, I understood the danger wasn't in what had happened. It was in what was now undeniable. Because 3 months ago, I made a decision that changed the course of everything, and before I share the truth I've buried deep inside, I need to ask you something. Have you ever been so seen by someone that it terrified you? If yes, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and let me take you back to where it all began. Some women wait for a dramatic betrayal, a discovered text message, a lipstick-stained collar, a sudden confession in the middle of dinner. But my story didn't begin with any of that. It began in silence. In the stillness of early spring mornings, when the only sound in the house was the soft clinking of dishes and the occasional creak of the hallway floorboards. My husband had left for work before sunrise, like he always did. He had a routine. A life with firm boundaries and expectations. Coffee at 6, shower at 6:30, out the door before 7. On paper, he was a good man. A faithful man. He provided, never raised his voice, never forgot anniversaries. But somewhere along the way, he had stopped looking at me. Not in the "you're still beautiful" way. Not even in the "what's for dinner" way. He just stopped. I had become part of the furniture. A functional element in the architecture of his day. I sat at the breakfast table, staring at the untouched toast and reading the same sentence in the newspaper 3 times. I didn't even like the news. I just liked the feeling of being occupied. Of not drifting. Then I heard movement in the guest room. The slow drag of feet. I had almost forgotten he was staying with us. He was my husband's son from a previous marriage. I had met him when he was already a teenager. We had always kept a polite distance, not quite strangers but never close. He had grown into a quiet young man, the kind who seemed constantly lost in thought. He was studying fine art and had returned home for a few weeks to finish a project. My husband had offered the guest room without asking. That was typical. I said nothing, also typical. That morning, he entered the kitchen with a sketchpad under one arm and a sleepy look on his face. His hair was a mess. He nodded to me, poured himself coffee, and sat across the table without saying a word. The silence wasn't awkward. It was just there. "You're working early," I said finally, gesturing to the pad. "I have a deadline." "A final portfolio for review," he said. "They want original figures. Not just references." I nodded, not really knowing what that meant. "I've been struggling with inspiration," he added, half smiling. "I can't paint empty ideas." I looked at him. "And what are full ideas made of?" His smile deepened. "People. Real people." It hung in the air, that sentence. I didn't know what he meant by it. Maybe he didn't either. But it stayed with me the rest of the day. Later that afternoon, I walked past the door to the converted garage, which he had turned into a makeshift studio. The door was ajar. I paused. Inside, the light from the side window cast a warm spill across the floor. There were canvases everywhere. Some leaned against the walls, others stacked in corners. Smudges of charcoal and streaks of paint covered almost every surface. There was something messy, raw, alive about the space. It was nothing like the sterile cleanliness of our main house. It smelled of oil paint and turpentine. It smelled like work. Like passion. I stepped inside without thinking. He was standing in front of a canvas, headphones in, brush in hand. He didn't hear me right away. I watched him work, the way his arm moved in swift, confident gestures. He was in flow, completely unaware of the world around him. When he noticed me, he pulled off the headphones quickly. "Sorry," I said. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not," he said, catching his breath. "Actually, would you mind staying?" I blinked. "Here?" "Just sit. Over there. It's not formal or anything. I just need someone real in the room. Something to focus on. Something real." I should have said no. I had laundry to do. A call to return. A dinner to plan. But I sat down. Right there on the old armchair near the window, surrounded by half-finished works and forgotten brushes. He didn't look at me like a stepson. He looked at me like I was a subject. Not romantically. Not lasciviously. Just with a kind of intense concentration that made my skin prickle. "You don't have to do anything," he said. "Just be." That was the beginning. That evening, as I folded towels and listened to the faint hum of my husband's voice on the phone in the other room, my mind wandered back to that moment. The way he had looked at me. The way I had felt seen. Not for how I served or supported or functioned. But for how I existed. How I sat. How I breathed. It terrified me. And it thrilled me. I told myself it was harmless. That it was just a passing curiosity on his part. That I had imagined the intensity. That a boy like him, no, a man like him, couldn't possibly be interested in a woman like me. A woman who had passed 50. A woman who had settled. But the next morning, when I saw him at the table again, sketchpad closed and untouched, he looked up at me with the same focus as before. And I knew, without words, that this wasn't over. The second time I sat for him, the air between us felt different. Not heavy, not awkward, just charged, like the seconds had learned to hum. I hadn't intended to return to the studio. In fact, I had promised myself the night before that it had been a one-time indulgence. A fleeting curiosity. But come morning, I found my feet moving before my thoughts had a chance to catch up. I knocked on the side door softly, almost hoping he wouldn't hear. But he did. He opened the door, still wearing that same paint-smeared shirt and tousled look. He stepped aside to let me in without a word. There was no need to explain. The room smelled even stronger this time. Paint, wood, a faint trace of something citrusy, his soap, maybe. The canvas from the previous day had been moved to the far wall and turned around, its face hidden. In its place stood a fresh one, blank and waiting. He pointed to the chair near the window. The same one I had occupied before. This time, I didn't hesitate. I sat, adjusted my robe instinctively. It wasn't revealing, not really. But something in the way he observed made me hyper-aware of every fold, every gesture, every breath I took. He didn't say much. Just a soft, "Look this way," and a small nod of encouragement when I got into position. His hands moved quickly, as if trying to catch something fragile before it slipped away. I didn't dare ask what he saw. Outside, birds chirped, a lawnmower groaned in the distance. Inside, only the scratching of charcoal and the occasional creak of the floorboard broke the silence. I found my mind wandering, floating between memory and sensation. I thought about my body, not with shame, but with curiosity. When had it become foreign to me? I had once known every inch like a song. I used to take pride in how my hips moved, how my shoulders framed a neckline. Now, most mornings, I barely looked in the mirror. I dressed for function, not attention. But sitting here, watched, studied, I remembered what it felt like to be observed without judgment. To be seen not for age or obligation, but for the way light played on skin. For the story told by a wrinkle near the eye, or the soft shadow at the collarbone. He stepped back, squinting at the canvas. His brow furrowed in concentration. Then, without a word, he moved forward again and adjusted a strand of my hair. His fingers brushed my cheek. It was brief, almost clinical. But my skin reacted like it had been set alight. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I just breathed. When he returned to the easel, I felt the weight of that moment settle between us. Neither of us acknowledged it. It didn't need to be named. After about an hour, he lowered his brush. "That's enough for today," he said softly. I nodded, unsure of what to say. As I stood, I felt a strange mixture of gratitude and guilt. Gratitude for being remembered by the world. Guilt for how good that felt. As I turned to leave, he reached out and gently touched my wrist. Not possessive. Not pleading. Just a pause. A connection. We kissed. It was quiet. No music swelled, no thunder clapped. It happened in a pocket of stillness, a breath held too long. It wasn't about desire, it was about recognition. About finally seeing and being seen. I pulled away first. I didn't speak. Neither did he. I walked out the door, my heart thudding like it hadn't in years. Back in the house, I went straight to the bathroom and stared at my reflection. I half expected to see a stranger. But it was still me. Same lines, same tired eyes. And yet, something was different. I looked more awake. More alive. I touched my lips. Not because of what had happened, but because I couldn't forget how it felt. That night, dinner with my husband was routine. He talked about deadlines and office politics. I nodded, smiled, said all the right things. He didn't notice I had barely touched my food. He didn't ask why I was quiet. He never did. Later, in bed, I lay awake while he snored gently beside me. The ceiling above felt endless. I imagined the canvas in the garage, half-filled, perhaps already drying. Was I beautiful on it? Was I real? The next morning, I hesitated by the studio door. But I didn't enter. I kept walking, pretending I was on my way to water the plants. He didn't call me in. He didn't text. And yet, for the rest of the day, I thought about little else. There was no plan. No strategy. I wasn't chasing excitement or drama. I just wanted to exist again. To be more than the sum of chores and silences. To feel like I mattered. And somehow, without saying so, I knew he understood. We had crossed a line. And yet, nothing felt out of place. Everything felt disturbingly natural. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood by the kitchen sink, rinsing dishes I hadn't used, letting the water run too long. Outside, I saw him cross the yard toward the side gate, sketchpad under one arm, a cigarette in the other hand. He didn't look toward the house. He didn't need to. We were both waiting. For what, I wasn't yet sure. But I knew I would return. The next few days unfolded in a pattern both familiar and unnerving. I would rise early, perform the rituals of domesticity with practiced hands, brewing coffee, folding linens, tending the quiet corners of the house, and all the while, I could feel the presence of the studio in the back of my mind, like a low hum beneath everything. My husband, as ever, moved through his routines with mechanical precision. His briefcase clicked shut at the same moment each morning, his footsteps echoed across the tiles, and his farewell peck on my cheek was as dry and predictable as the toast he preferred for breakfast. I didn't resent him. But I noticed, now more than ever, how little he noticed me. One afternoon, after dusting books I hadn't touched in years, I found myself walking toward the studio. I didn't announce myself. I simply opened the door and stepped in. He was seated at the far end, back hunched, working on a piece I couldn't yet see. He looked up when I entered but said nothing, only gave a quiet nod and cleared a stool near the easel with a single sweep of his arm. I sat. This time, there was no verbal agreement, no suggested pose. He just looked at me and began to sketch. The light was different that day. Warmer. The air smelled of lemon wood, cleaner and faint sweat, as if the room had absorbed the heat of something unspoken. I sat still, but not stiff. I let my shoulders drop. I didn't hold my stomach in. I allowed myself to exist in that space the way I hadn't in years, unmanaged. Time blurred. I wasn't thinking anymore. I was feeling. There was a strange kind of safety in being rendered in charcoal. No judgments. Just observation. And through that lens, I felt more human than I had in months. At one point, he rose from his chair and walked around me, changing angles, eyes flicking between my posture and the canvas. I caught a glimpse of his sketch and inhaled sharply. It was unmistakably me, but not the version I passed in mirrors. It was deeper, almost too honest. I saw a tension in the way he shaped my hands, as if they were grasping something invisible. I saw softness in the way he drew the lines of my neck, almost reverent. He stopped beside me for a moment. Our shoulders nearly touched. I didn't turn to him. I could feel his breath near my ear, steady and unhurried. And in that breath, in that stillness, there was a message. Not a request. Not a confession. Just a truth neither of us needed to speak. When the session ended, I didn't leave right away. I stood beside the easel, looking at myself. He watched me. I knew he was expecting a reaction, approval, surprise, perhaps even rejection, but I had none of those. I only felt weightless. "It's beautiful," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. He nodded once. "Thank you for letting me see you." I walked home slowly, my legs unsure whether to tremble or stride. That evening, my husband sat on the porch, scrolling through his phone. I joined him, placing a cup of tea on the armrest between us. He looked up briefly, smiled, then returned to reading something on the screen. I watched his profile in the fading light, noting the lines around his mouth, the slight sag at his jawline. He had aged. We both had. But while I had grown quieter, softer, he had become sharper. Edges without warmth. "Did you go for a walk today?" he asked, still not looking up. "I did," I replied. "Through the garden." He nodded. "You should plant something new this season." The hydrangeas looked tired. I wanted to laugh. Not because he was wrong, but because of how utterly small the suggestion felt in the face of everything swelling inside me. I simply sipped my tea and said nothing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed beneath the sheets, my mind replaying details, the sound of the charcoal stick gliding across canvas, the way my knee had trembled slightly as I shifted position, the intensity of his eyes when they found mine. I didn't want to admit it, but I craved it again. Not just the attention. The interpretation. The way he reflected me back to myself, reshaped and reimagined. I told myself it was about the art. That what he captured was more important than the reasons behind it. That the energy in the room was sacred, not forbidden. But in truth, it was both. The next morning, I woke before dawn and stood at the mirror brushing my hair. I chose a blouse I hadn't worn in years, light silk, pale gray, elegant in its restraint. I wasn't dressing up. I was preparing. When I stepped into the studio again, he was already working. He didn't seem surprised to see me. He gestured toward a different stool, angled more toward the window. "Something different today," he said. "I want to try light on movement." Movement. I shifted slowly, draping one arm over the backrest, twisting my torso slightly. It wasn't a dramatic change, but the adjustment exposed a line from my collarbone to my shoulder blade. I felt vulnerable and yet powerful. As he worked, I closed my eyes. I let my thoughts go. I thought of youth, not as something I had lost, but as something I was remembering differently. Not the parties, the clothes, the attention, but the certainty. The sense of being present in a moment without needing to question it. Here, now, I felt that again. I didn't notice how long we remained like that, in the quiet duet of artist and subject. But when I finally stood, the sun had shifted, the room golden with late afternoon light. As I moved toward the door, he said softly, "You're changing." I paused. "Am I?" "Yes," he said, his voice thoughtful. "You're returning to yourself." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Back in the house, the air felt stale. Not dirty, just lifeless. I walked room to room, touching surfaces, trailing my fingers along familiar edges. Everything was in its place, and yet, I felt displaced. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at my hands. Same lines. Same veins. But now they carried a trace of something more. It wasn't love. Not yet. It wasn't betrayal. Not yet. It was something in between. And I wasn't ready to let it go. The days that followed felt unreal, like a slow-motion shift in gravity. Nothing was outwardly different, meals were cooked, floors were swept, conversations happened over coffee, but something beneath the surface had realigned. Or maybe it had been misaligned for years, and only now I was noticing. I became more aware of myself. Not in a self-conscious way, but in the way an old building might creak, newly aware of its foundations. I noticed the way my hips moved when I walked, the way sunlight hit my skin through the window, the gentle weight of my own presence in a room. I started sitting in different chairs around the house just to feel things differently. My husband remained unchanged. He was courteous, calm, diligent. But distant. And now, with something to compare his gaze to, I saw the vacancy in his eyes when he looked at me. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't even cold. It was simply disconnection. I had become a fixture in his day, not a person with weight, needs, or desire. One afternoon, after he left for work, I opened the closet and pulled out a box from the back of the top shelf. Inside were a few old clothes I hadn't worn in years. Not impractical or revealing, just softer, more fluid. A loose cream blouse, a dark green skirt with a high waist, and a thin gold chain I used to wear around my neck when I still made time for small things. I dressed slowly, paying attention to the feel of fabric against my skin. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't look younger. But I looked clearer, somehow. As if I had stepped slightly back into focus. I went to the studio without hesitation. The door was open. He was inside, organizing brushes, wiping down a palette. He glanced up when I entered, and I saw his eyes change, not in shock, not in admiration, but in awareness. He didn't say anything. He simply gestured to the corner where a new canvas had been prepped. "I've been thinking," he said after a moment. I want to try something different today. What kind of different? I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. He walked to a bench by the window and adjusted a stool beside it. Not a pose, he said. A position. Movement. Something real. Not stillness, intention. I took off my shoes, sat down, shifted slightly. I let my hand rest on the back of the stool, let one leg fall a little to the side. I wasn't trying to be seductive. I was trying to be honest. I let my body decide how it wanted to be. He observed for a while, saying nothing. His gaze wasn't invasive. It was attentive. And in that attentiveness, I found permission to breathe. The first few strokes were broad, fast. Then came the fine work, charcoal, quick lines, then oil mixed with something dark and warm. He moved closer, sometimes circling me, sometimes stopping altogether, as if trying to see not just the outer form but the space I took up. I stayed silent. I felt like I was witnessing my own becoming. Halfway through the session, he paused. "You're different today," he said quietly. I didn't ask what he meant. I already knew. I felt different. "I'm remembering something," I said. "What is it?" "Who I used to be." That was all we said. It was enough. After we finished, I stood and walked toward the canvas. He blocked it gently with his body, almost unconsciously. "Not yet," he said. "Why?" "Because it's not just about you. It's about what you're becoming." I nodded. I understood that more than I could explain. Back in the house, I moved through the rooms like a person rediscovering her own home. I noticed the dents in the wood near the stairs, the faint stain on the carpet from years ago, the way the curtains swayed with the air conditioner. These things had always been here. But now, they seemed to belong to someone else. Someone I had grown away from without noticing. At dinner, my husband asked if I had done anything interesting that day. I said I had gone through some old things. He didn't press further. Later that night, while he watched television, I sat at the kitchen table and opened a notebook. Blank pages stared back at me. I wrote down a single line: "How long can a person live without being seen?" I closed the book. That one sentence was enough. The next morning, he left early for a weekend business trip. 2 days. That was all. I stood at the door as he packed his car, waved as he pulled out of the driveway. He waved back with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. When the car disappeared down the street, the house became quiet again. Too quiet. I waited an hour before walking to the studio. He was there. He had been expecting me. I could tell. There was a new setup, a large canvas, a background already painted in warm, earthy tones. A stool placed in the center, angled toward the side window where the light streamed in. He said nothing. Neither did I. I took my place. This time, he worked faster. He didn't stop to look for long. He trusted his memory, his instinct. I could feel the rhythm in his movements, the energy in each stroke. It was no longer about details, it was about essence. Time slipped. When we finally paused, I asked, "What do you see when you look at me?" He didn't answer right away. "Depth," he said finally. "Restraint. And something trying very hard not to break through." I didn't reply. I looked at the canvas. He didn't stop me this time. What I saw wasn't a portrait. It was a story. It was me, but not as I saw myself. It was the woman I had hidden away in layers of responsibility, silence, and routine. It was vulnerability and power at once. It was everything I had forgotten how to be. I reached out, touched the edge of the canvas lightly with my fingertips, careful not to smudge the paint. Thank you, I whispered. He didn't move. That evening, alone in the kitchen, I opened a bottle of wine we had been saving for a special occasion. I poured a glass and sat by the window. The house felt enormous. Empty, but not lonely. Spacious in a way that invited thought. I didn't feel guilty. I felt awake. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what that meant. The morning after felt still, as if even the air had paused to consider what came next. I woke before the sun had fully climbed the sky, the house quiet in that soft, golden hour where nothing stirs yet. My husband wouldn't return until the evening, and the knowledge of that left me in a peculiar limbo, half weightless, half burdened. I sat at the kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a lukewarm mug of tea, eyes drifting out the window. The garden had begun to bloom again. Small signs of spring pushing up from the soil, daffodils, young leaves, that delicate haze of green on bare branches. It reminded me of what I was feeling, something resurfacing after being dormant for too long. I couldn't explain what was happening between us. It wasn't an affair, not in the physical sense. It was attention. Focus. A kind of dialogue that had nothing to do with words. I didn't know if it was dangerous yet. But it was certainly real. That afternoon, he found me before I found him. I had been standing on the back porch, reading a book I wasn't absorbing, when I saw him walk across the lawn toward me. He stopped a few feet away, hands in the pockets of his jacket. "I'm working on something new," he said. "I think it's ready for a second eye." I followed him to the studio, more out of instinct than decision. Inside, the light had changed. Late afternoon now, deeper shadows, more contrast. The room felt warmer, more intimate, the way a theater does just before the curtain rises. He led me to the back wall where a canvas stood, turned to face the corner. Slowly, he rotated it toward me. The painting was a portrait. But not a traditional one. It wasn't just a depiction of me sitting or standing, it was me in movement, half-turned, caught mid-breath, as if I had been seen in a moment I didn't know someone was watching. The colors were subtle but alive. Soft greens, amber undertones, a touch of silver near the neckline of the blouse I had worn that day. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't stylized. It was intimate. My first reaction wasn't fear or embarrassment. It was awe. Not because of how I looked, but because of how I felt looking at myself through his hands. "This is how you see me?" I asked. He nodded. I didn't realize I still looked like that. "You do," he said. I turned away from the painting, not because I didn't want to see it, but because I needed a second to steady myself. I felt unwrapped, exposed, but not violated. Understood. We stood there, the silence filling in the cracks we didn't try to seal. And in that silence, something passed between us, an acknowledgement of what had been created, and what had been stirred. I stepped closer to him. Not with a plan. Not even with intention. Just a movement that felt necessary. We kissed. It was not rushed. It was not hesitant. It was not rehearsed. It was brief. Quiet. But it left something echoing in my chest for hours afterward. When I left the studio, the sun had dipped just behind the roofline of the house. I could feel the warmth fading from the day, a coolness rising from the soil. I walked inside without glancing back. Dinner that night was solitary. I didn't eat much. My appetite had shifted, no longer for food, but for clarity, for stillness, for something I couldn't yet name. I went to bed early. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator down the hall and the ticking of the old clock in the living room. I could still feel the shape of his lips against mine, not because of desire, but because of the meaning. That kiss had changed the temperature of everything. The next morning, I kept myself busy. Laundry, errands, checking the mail, watering the plants. I tried to distract myself from the weight of the previous day. From the fact that the line had been crossed, gently but firmly. When my husband returned that evening, he entered the house with his usual rhythm. He set down his suitcase near the door, kissed my cheek, asked about dinner. I watched him as he moved through the kitchen, opening the refrigerator, making small comments about the state of the shelves. It was as if nothing had changed. And perhaps, from where he stood, nothing had. I nodded in the right places, answered with soft tones, and smiled when appropriate. But something in me was watching from the outside now, a step removed from my own life. That night, we ate together at the table, the sound of forks against plates louder than usual. He talked about the conference, figures, clients, meetings. I listened, but my mind drifted. I kept seeing the painting. Not as an object on a wall, but as a mirror I couldn't look away from. I excused myself early and went upstairs. I sat at the vanity, brushing my hair out slowly. I looked at my face in the mirror, same lines, same aging skin, same familiar features. But something beneath them had shifted. A light in the eyes. A quiet firmness in the jaw. Before going to bed, I opened the drawer where I had placed a copy of that portrait, just a photo, printed from his phone when he said he wanted me to keep one. I looked at it again, studied the expression. I couldn't tell if the woman in the painting was lost or found. Maybe she was both. And maybe that was the beginning of everything that would come next. I began avoiding mirrors. Not out of shame, but because I didn't need them anymore. For years, I had looked into them searching for signs of beauty, of age, of relevance. Lately, I had started to see something more honest than any reflection. I had started to see myself in brushstrokes, in shadows, in the spaces between words that were never said aloud. The days passed like quiet chapters in a book I hadn't realized I'd started writing. The house carried on. My husband continued his routines, his movements seamless, predictable. I moved around him carefully, not out of guilt but out of an unspoken courtesy. I wasn't hiding. But I wasn't offering truths either. Not yet. He didn't notice much. He never had, really. Not the subtle shift in how I did my hair, or how I lingered at the window longer than before. Not the way my hands paused midair while folding laundry, caught in thought. There had always been a space between us. I just hadn't known how wide it had grown. One afternoon, while reorganizing the linen closet, I found a photo tucked into the back of a drawer. It was from years ago, our first vacation together, standing on a beach, sunburned and laughing. My eyes were brighter, my smile less measured. I sat on the floor for a long time, the photo resting on my lap. I remembered how it felt to be that version of myself, open and curious. The woman in the picture wasn't flawless, but she was engaged, with the world, with him, with herself. And now? Now I was in the process of waking up again, in a different way. That evening, I returned to the studio. Not as a subject, not even as a visitor. Just as a presence. He was there, as always with brush in hand, brow furrowed in focus. He didn't look up when I entered, but I knew he'd felt me. I stood quietly for a moment, watching him work. There was something reverent in the way he handled the canvas. No rush, no urgency. Just respect for the process, for the person taking form beneath the layers. "I've been thinking," I said finally. He set his brush down and turned, not startled, just attentive. I gestured vaguely, "whatever it is we're doing, it's become more than painting." He didn't deny it. "It's still art," he said. "But it's also witness." I didn't fully understand what he meant then. But I felt it. He asked if I wanted to pose again. I nodded. This time, I chose how I sat. I arranged the chair myself, positioned the light how it felt right to me. I untied my hair, letting it fall in waves I hadn't bothered to style in months. I wore a soft, loose blouse that clung just enough to remind me I had shape, intention. As he painted, I closed my eyes. I thought about the space between people, the silence between words, the moments when glances linger too long, the weight of unsaid things that hang in doorways and hallways. I thought about how often we live beside one another without ever really colliding. But this was a collision. A quiet, slow one. Not a crash, but a merging. A recognition. When he was finished, I didn't ask to see the work. I didn't need to. I could feel the truth of it in my bones. Afterward, we sat on the floor, backs against the wall, the smell of oil and turpentine clinging to the air. We didn't speak. We didn't have to. The silence was thick with mutual understanding. Later that night, back in the main house, I walked past the hallway mirror and caught my reflection. I stopped. For the first time in weeks, I let myself look. My face was older. That hadn't changed. But something else had. My shoulders were pulled back slightly, my mouth softer at the edges. I looked like someone in the middle of remembering herself. In bed, I lay beside my husband, listening to the gentle rhythm of his breathing. He had fallen asleep almost instantly, as he always did. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, wondering what version of me he still held in his mind. Was it the woman from the vacation photo? The one who filled silences with laughter and surprise? Or was it the version who had become his calendar, his routine, his mirror image? I didn't know. But I was certain that the version of me being captured in that studio was no longer his. The next morning, I walked into the studio without knocking. He was already there, working on something new. He glanced up, surprised but not displeased. I had a thought, I said. Would you ever consider showing these? Publicly? He paused, then shook his head. They're not for a gallery. Why not? They're not portraits, he said. They're stories. I understood then that this was not about ownership. Not about sharing. It was about preservation. He wasn't trying to expose me. He was trying to hold on to something ephemeral, something I had lost long before and only now was reclaiming. That day, I didn't pose. I just watched him work. The way his fingers moved across the canvas reminded me of memory, of things too delicate to describe but too powerful to forget. I stood there until the sun moved across the window, casting long shadows on the floor. When I finally left the studio, I didn't feel uncertain. I didn't feel reckless. I felt grounded. That evening, my husband suggested a dinner with guests the following week, a small gathering. Old friends. We haven't done that in a while, he said. I agreed. I wasn't sure who I would be by then. But I knew one thing. I wasn't finished becoming. The morning began with a familiar kind of silence, the one that stretches through the house when someone has left early, leaving behind the scent of their shaving cream and the sound of a closing door. My husband had taken a short trip to meet with clients out of town, and though he would return by the next evening, his absence gave the day a different shape. One I felt across my shoulders the moment I sat up in bed. The sun filtered through the blinds, casting slender stripes across the hardwood floor. I stood by the window longer than usual, one hand pressed to the glass. The garden was quiet. The wind shifted the leaves, but everything else was still. I didn't move for a while. I wasn't stalling. I was listening. Listening to the stillness, to the way time felt more fluid when the house was only mine. By mid-morning, I was dressed. Not carefully, not dramatically. Simply with awareness. I wore soft cotton, a blouse I hadn't reached for in years. I brushed my hair, added a faint touch of color to my cheeks, not for anyone, but for myself. My body moved slowly through the hallway, as if the air had grown heavier. But it wasn't dread. It was something else. Something like anticipation, but softer. A quiet inevitability. When I arrived at the studio, I didn't knock. I had stopped doing that days ago. He was already there, cleaning brushes, lining up tubes of paint. His back was to me, but I knew he had heard the door open. The light in the room was calm, clouds shifting, casting an even glow across the space. Everything looked less sharp, less defined. I stepped inside and waited. He turned and looked at me for a long moment, not questioning, not commanding. Just meeting my eyes like we were in on the same, unspoken agreement. "Today's the last," he said. I understood what he meant. He gestured to the canvas, already prepared. A new one. Larger. Different shape. "I want to capture something full," he said, his voice low. Not static. Not a moment. The whole. I didn't reply. I simply moved to the center of the room, removed my cardigan, and sat on the chair he'd placed for me. I adjusted the way I was seated, turned slightly, spine upright, hands relaxed in my lap. I looked toward the window, not at him. He began to paint. There were no words exchanged after that. Only the movement of his brush, the rustling of his sleeve against the canvas, the quiet creaks of the wooden floor beneath him. Time slowed. My breathing synced with the rhythm of his strokes. I wasn't thinking about the composition, the colors, the end result. I was thinking about what had led me here. About the 1,000 quiet choices that had formed the path beneath my feet. Each glance. Each silence. Each time I didn't correct a misassumption, each time I turned toward a voice that made me feel real again. I remembered our first session, the nervousness in my fingers, the hesitance in my jaw. And now I sat with my back straight, my gaze steady. I didn't hide. I didn't shrink. He circled once to adjust the light, briefly meeting my eyes as he passed. There was no expectation. No apology. Only recognition. We both knew what we were doing. And neither of us flinched. I heard the brush pause, the faint sound of him stepping back. "It's finished," he said. I didn't rise. I waited. He stood beside the canvas and turned it toward me. I didn't react immediately. I looked. I let my eyes absorb the color, the angles, the softness in places, the rawness in others. It wasn't just me. It was the echo of every version of me that had lived in silence. The woman who hosted dinners, who packed suitcases, who smiled politely in the mirror while fixing her lipstick for events she didn't want to attend. The woman who had been told she was too sensitive, too quiet, too dramatic, too still. She was all there. And so was the new part. The part that had emerged not through rebellion, but through reflection. The part that no longer needed to be explained. I didn't speak. We didn't need to say anything. He stepped closer and stood beside me. The space between us thinned, not closed, but softened. The moment lingered, not like a cliff, but like a shoreline. Not dangerous. But irreversible. We spent the night together. It wasn't about escape or conquest or filling a void. It wasn't an act of rebellion. It was the surrender of a long-held breath. The silence between us finally folded into itself, becoming something solid, something lived. In the early morning hours, I lay awake. Not anxious. Not guilty. Simply present. The room smelled like paint and skin and sleep. The window was open slightly, and I could hear the wind brushing through the trees. I turned my head and looked at him, not out of wonder or fear, but simply to remember. His chest rose and fell in quiet rhythm. The line of his jaw softened by sleep, the small calluses on his fingers still marked with faint traces of color. I rose quietly, careful not to disturb him, and gathered my clothes. As I stepped outside into the early dawn, I felt the air shift against my face. The grass was wet. The light was blue and gray and full of promise. I walked back to the house slowly, barefoot. Every step felt deliberate. Each movement a closing of one door and the slow, steady turning of a new handle. Inside, the house was silent again. Familiar. Waiting. I didn't go back to bed. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a fresh cup of tea, and watched the sun rise through the windows. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something. I felt like I had arrived. I spent the morning moving through the house with deliberate slowness, as if adjusting to a new layer of air. Everything looked the same: walls, windows, light fixtures, but my body moved differently within the familiar. The floorboards under my feet felt steadier. The kettle's whistle more musical. I folded towels more precisely, not because I had to, but because my hands needed something gentle to do. I avoided the studio. It wasn't out of fear. It was reverence. The silence between us had expanded after that night, but not in avoidance. It had become a shared understanding. A space where nothing more needed to be taken, explained, or hidden. By the afternoon, I was in the garden, pulling weeds with half-gloved hands. The dirt cooled my palms. The wind tugged gently at my blouse. I let the silence stretch around me until the sound of a car pulled into the driveway. My husband was home. He stepped out with his usual calm, the keys in one hand, bag over the shoulder, sunglasses still on. He looked at me from across the yard and smiled. Not suspicious. Not questioning. Just the same warm, habitual smile I had seen for decades. "Looks like the flowers are surviving," he said. "They are," I replied, dusting soil from my hands. We exchanged a few lines of pleasant nothing before heading inside. I moved with him, placing his suitcase near the stairs, asking about his meetings, nodding at the predictable answers. It all felt balanced. Stable. Except it wasn't. Because the version of me who stood in that hallway, smoothing the wrinkles from her blouse, was not the version he had left behind. And somewhere inside, I think he knew. That night, I sat across from him at the dinner table. He talked more than usual, perhaps energized by his meetings, or perhaps trying to reassert something in our rhythm. I listened. I answered. But I remained aware of the quiet pull of something else, something just beneath the surface of my skin. After dinner, he went to his office to sort through emails. I stayed in the kitchen, slowly washing the dishes by hand, though the dishwasher sat empty beside me. There was something comforting in the warm water and the soft clink of plates. My reflection in the window above the sink was vague and backlit, the shape of a woman standing still but moving deeply inside. The next morning, the house resumed its old habits. My husband left early, muttering a reminder about an upcoming dinner with guests later that week. I nodded, though I hadn't forgotten. I had been rehearsing for that dinner in my mind for days: what I would wear, how I would speak, what version of myself would greet old friends at the door. The rest of the day passed in fragments. I found a note I had written to myself weeks earlier in the back of a drawer, just one line scribbled on a torn envelope: "Remember what it feels like to be unfinished." I folded it and slipped it into my pocket. That afternoon, I stood at the edge of the studio's doorway but didn't go in. He wasn't there. The light fell in long golden streaks across the floorboards. The easel still held the last painting, now dry. The chair I had sat in leaned slightly off-center, just as I had left it. something caught my eye on the small table in the corner. A square envelope. I hesitated, then crossed the room and picked it up. Inside was a photograph. A print of the painting. Smaller, of course, and softened in detail, but unmistakable. Me. Or rather, the version of me I had helped bring forward. There was no note. No signature. Only a single pencil mark on the back, a quiet slash of charcoal, sharp and intentional. I placed it back in the envelope and pressed it to my chest for a moment before slipping it into my coat pocket. I stood in the middle of the studio and let the silence settle again. When I returned to the house, my husband was on the phone, pacing through the living room as he often did when discussing business. I passed by him with a smile, moving toward the kitchen to start dinner. He mouthed a quick thank you as I disappeared into the hallway. I prepared the meal slowly, savoring the slicing of vegetables, the sizzle in the pan, the arrangement of each plate. Cooking had always been a chore, but tonight it felt like creation. A way to gather the floating pieces of myself and ground them in something tangible. We ate in relative quiet, punctuated by updates from his trip, mentions of mutual friends, reminders about schedules. He didn't notice my silences. Or perhaps he did and had decided not to name them. That night, I sat by the window while he dozed off in front of the television. I watched the way the moonlight settled across the garden stones, the way the shadows formed familiar shapes and then unraveled them. I touched the envelope still in my pocket. Not tightly. Just enough to remember. And then, gently, I let it go. Not out of dismissal, but completion. In the days that followed, I began to change small things. I rearranged the books in the living room. I swapped out the dusty vase in the hallway for one I had found years ago but never displayed. I opened windows more often, letting the air pass through the house in new directions. I no longer waited to be seen. I chose when and how I would be visible. And when the dinner evening approached, the one my husband had planned with our old friends, I stood in front of the closet and selected a dress I hadn't worn in years. It wasn't bold or loud. But it fit me now. Clean lines, soft fabric, a quiet elegance. I stood in the mirror and fastened the necklace. Then I looked at myself, not searching for flaws, not bracing for critique, but witnessing. The doorbell rang. I turned toward the sound and walked forward, ready. The evening arrived with a kind of theatrical tension, quiet and carefully constructed. The house had been cleaned, the table set, candles trimmed, wine decanted. Everything had been prepared with the same precision we'd used for decades when hosting friends, down to the linen napkins and polished silverware that only emerged for occasions like this. But beneath the familiar gestures, something had shifted. I moved differently through the space, not out of nerves, but awareness. I wasn't rehearsing how to present myself. I had already decided who I was willing to be. Our guests arrived just after 7. Laughter filtered in with the opening door. Familiar voices, practiced hugs, compliments on the house and the garden. My husband, ever the gracious host, guided them in with charm and comfort. I offered drinks, took coats, and soon we were all settled in the living room, glasses in hand, voices weaving between past and present. The conversations felt scripted at first, retelling the same anecdotes, circling the same topics. But I watched people carefully. I always had. It was something I'd done quietly in the background over the years, studying the way people told stories, where they placed their hands, how long they let silence linger before filling it. At some point, someone asked about the studio. They had heard that the guest room had been converted into an art space. My husband nodded and waved toward the hallway. Yes, our boy's been working on a few pieces here. You should see what he's done. Quite impressive. The shift in my spine was immediate. Subtle. But undeniable. One of the women, a friend I hadn't seen in years, asked if there were any portraits. He always had an eye for expression, she said. He used to draw all of us in high school, remember? I smiled softly and nodded, avoiding her gaze. My hands stayed folded in my lap. He's done a few, my husband said casually. Actually, there's one I was hoping to show you all, if it's finished. He stood to go check. My pulse didn't rise. Not in panic, not in fear. But in a strange stillness, like the room had changed temperature by a single degree and only I could feel it. Moments passed. I heard the studio door open. A pause. Footsteps. Then silence. Then his voice, "Well, you'll want to see this." I stood. I don't remember walking to the hallway. Only the sense of light pulling me forward. In the studio, they had gathered in a loose semicircle around the canvas. My husband stood nearest to it, one hand slightly lifted, as if he had just unveiled it moments before. They didn't speak. The portrait, if you could call it that, was centered, commanding. It wasn't grandiose. There were no flourishes or exaggerations. But the intimacy of it was undeniable. Me. Not static. Not still. Captured in motion, in thought. The lines of my arms drawn with tenderness, the tilt of my head caught mid-shift, eyes focused on something beyond the frame. A woman not posing, but existing. A woman observed in the moment she forgot anyone was watching. The palette was subdued. Earth tones, soft grays, hints of gold near the neckline. It was as if light itself had been painted, not just form. One of the guests finally broke the silence. "It's remarkable." Another murmured, "It feels so personal." My husband nodded slowly, eyes still on the painting. "It is." Then, he looked at me. There was no anger in his face. No accusation. Only something unreadable. A kind of calculation behind his gaze, like a puzzle he had begun to understand, one piece at a time. I held his gaze. Neither of us said a word. After a moment, he turned back to the guests. "He didn't tell us who it was meant to be," he said, almost offhandedly. "But I suppose now it's obvious." The others chuckled gently. "It's you, of course," one said to me. "He captured you so perfectly." "I'm jealous." I gave a small smile. Not forced, but distant. I watched my husband as he poured more wine, laughing along, his posture relaxed. But something about his eyes had changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. We returned to the dining room. The evening moved on. Plates filled and emptied, glasses refilled. Laughter returned. But under the surface, I could feel the residue of the studio, the unspoken presence of that canvas still hanging in the back of everyone's mind. After dessert, our guests filtered out with warm hugs and thank yous. I held the door as they walked to their cars, watching their taillights disappear into the dark. When the door closed, I leaned against it for a moment, listening to the quiet. I turned and found him standing at the edge of the hallway, arms crossed loosely. "It's very good," he said. "Yes," I replied. There was a pause. "Then, he sees something in you." I nodded. "Something I haven't seen in a long time." He said it without accusation. Just observation. Like the painting itself. He didn't ask questions. Not then. He simply turned away and walked upstairs. I remained in the hallway, alone with the soft hum of the house around me. Later, after the dishes were washed and the lights dimmed, I stood once more in the doorway of the studio. The portrait still hung there, lit now only by the spill of moonlight through the window. I stepped closer. I studied her. The woman in the painting. The one who had come alive through brush and gaze. I didn't feel exposed. I felt recorded. Not just for others to see, but for myself, to remember that somewhere along the way, I had existed beyond the roles I played. And even if the consequences were waiting in the shadows, they could never erase the fact that I had been seen. Fully. Finally. The following morning arrived without ceremony. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that doesn't rush to be broken. I woke slowly, not to the chime of an alarm or the creak of a door, but to the soft awareness that something had ended, or shifted, and that life would continue anyway. I moved through the early hours with mechanical grace. Made the bed. Opened the blinds. Boiled water for tea. The sun was pale, filtering gently through the windows, drawing faint patterns on the tile floor. I stood barefoot, holding my mug, eyes following those shapes as if they contained instructions on what to do next. My husband came down later than usual. He was dressed for work, the same neutral tones, the same clean shave. He poured himself coffee, thanked me quietly, and sat at the table with his phone in hand. We exchanged pleasantries. No reference to the previous night. No comment about the painting. But the silence had changed. It was no longer filled with comfort or habit. It was hollow. He left soon after, closing the door behind him with the same soft click that had always marked the start of my day. But this time, it didn't start anything. I sat at the table long after he'd gone, fingers tracing the rim of my mug. I thought about the woman in the painting. I thought about how many years it had taken to see her. How many layers of silence and obligation I had worn before realizing they weren't clothing, but armor. There was no plan, no dramatic impulse. Just a quiet knowing that I couldn't return to the version of life that had existed before. Later, I walked to the studio. Not because I expected to find anyone there, but because I needed to be with the work. The painting still hung in the same place. It hadn't been moved, but somehow it felt further away now. As if the woman inside it had already begun to fade from public view and retreat into memory. I stood there for a long time. The brushes on the table had dried. The palette was still speckled with paint, but the texture had thickened, no longer usable. The chair in the corner had a faint indentation where I had sat so many times, proof that I had existed here, not just in image, but in weight and time. I ran my fingers along the edge of the canvas. I didn't need to look at the painting again. I had memorized it. The way one shoulder sloped, the placement of my hand, the curve of my lips, not smiling, not frowning, just alive. When I turned to leave, I noticed the door hadn't closed fully. It remained cracked, as if waiting for someone to return. I didn't close it. Back in the house, I opened a box from the back of the closet. Inside were old notebooks, sketches, a few photographs from years ago. Not many of them featured me. I had been the one behind the camera most of the time. Capturing others. Framing moments. Preserving things that I was often excluded from. I found one photo, taken during a vacation early in our marriage. I was standing on a pier, the wind catching my hair, laughing at something outside the frame. I studied it. Not to grieve who I was, but to understand her. What did she know then? What didn't she? She had been hopeful. Generous with her trust. Unaware of how much of herself would be quietly handed away in the name of peace, of support, of love that never asked questions. I put the photo on the windowsill, not as a keepsake, but as a witness. That afternoon, I took a walk around the neighborhood. The wind was brisk, and the sky low with gray, but I welcomed the chill. It woke the skin, reminded me that I was not only still here, but still changing. I passed homes that mirrored ours, well-kept lawns, tidy porches, cars parked neatly in driveways. People waved. I waved back. But I didn't stop. I kept walking, letting the rhythm of my steps echo thoughts I wasn't ready to speak aloud. When I returned, there was a package at the door. No return address. Just my name, in handwriting I recognized. Inside, carefully wrapped, was a small canvas. A study. A variation of the larger portrait, same posture, different angle. Less polished, more raw. A sketch made before the final version had taken shape. Tucked behind it was a note. A single sentence, written in the same charcoal pencil I had seen him use a dozen times. Even when you don't see yourself, you're still there. I stood with the painting in my hands, heart thudding gently, not from emotion, but from presence. From the realization that someone had paid attention when I hadn't. That someone had caught me in motion long before I knew I had begun to move. I hung the canvas in the upstairs hallway. Not where guests would pass, but where I would see it every morning. A reminder not of what had happened, but of what had opened. That evening, my husband returned home at his usual time. We shared dinner. Spoke of schedules, news, groceries. But he didn't mention the painting. Neither did I. After the table was cleared, I sat by the window, notebook in hand. I didn't write much. Just a few words. This version of me does not need permission. He passed behind me once or twice, saying nothing. He paused, as if to ask something, then continued upstairs. I remained at the window long after the sky had gone dark. The garden outside was quiet. The studio lights were off. The house was still. And in that stillness, I didn't feel alone. I felt whole.